Hi, I'm Jonathan Weinberg. Today I want to talk about something which I get a tremendous amount of questions from my artist friends who don't use fountain pens, and they always ask me, well, what fountain pen should I get? And I always have a lot of problems answering that question because I've come to realize that it makes a big difference how you use pens. How do you draw? What kind of drawings are you doing now, right? What kind of inks do you use? What kind of lines do you use? Also, how much money do you want to spend? And depending on how you answer those questions, that's the kind of pen that you should get. So the point is that there isn't going to be one pen necessarily that's going to be perfect pen for every artist, depending on what their expectations are. And once they get the bug, then they'll probably, like me, they'll go down all these different paths. But you really need to ask that person first, well, what kind of drawings are they doing now? And if you go back into the history of pens and drawing, you find out that really prior to the 1960s, artists use dip pens with nibs that drew with lines that were variable, right? They have a certain kind of flexibility to the type of nib that you use, that you draw with. So, for example, this kind of a dip pen with a nib that is similar to actually the kind of nibs that often cartoonists or comic book artists might use to do the outlines. And they dip them in the ink. And the disadvantages of that, the advantage is that you get wonderful line with this. The disadvantage is that you have to keep dipping in the ink. And often when you do that, I don't know if you're not experienced, you can get a blob of black ink on your paper. So that's not great, and you have to keep dipping it. And also it's not great if you're going on a trip and you don't want to carry around a big thing of ink with you and dip it into the ink. You want something that's portable. So post 1960s, really, artists start using markers, right? Almost a whole range of different kinds of pens, but here is a extra fine Pilot pen or a roller ball. These are all pens that people use. And these pens put down a very consistent line, right? Some of you, depending on how old you are, you can still get them, may have used or been familiar with a rapidograph. A rapidograph came with all these different very fine line and thick line pens, but each rapidograph would put down a very similar line. And if you want to get different line weights, you use different pens. So don't get me into the problems with rapidographs and how hard they are to clean and sensitive they were. But I still have a set of rapidographs which I don't use, but anyway, I still have one of those sets. Anyway, if you're the type of artist who uses a pen that puts down a consistent line like this, a marker, then you're really, in a way, your choices are huge. You have many, many choices, but it's not that complicated. And then the issue is, of course, how much money you want to spend. So I'm going to talk about, for most of the time in this video, about pens that come in under around $50 and can be as cheap as $4. So you might be happy, actually, with a Pilot Varsity V pen that is a disposable pen. This is a medium, and it puts down a consistent black line. And one of these pens will last quite a long time. And they actually are amazing because once they're capped, this pen I think I've had for years and years and years, and I just discovered it upstairs, and it still writes perfectly. Pilot makes terrific pens, no matter what the price point is. And this is a very reliable, terrific pen that you can take with you on a trip, and it only costs, as I say, around $4, and you can get them in packs of 6. And this lays down a very consistent line. But one of the great things about fountain pens is that they they're not disposable. You can put all kinds of different colors in them and change the color. So you're not getting that with this pen. And so you probably want to get something that's a little better than that. And I recommend strongly, again, let me keep this in mind, this is if you want a consistent line. The points, the nib that you're getting in the pens that I'm talking about here are not going to give you any variation. So one obvious choice is the Safari. This is a Safari Vista, but this also comes as a regular Safari. And it depends here on what line width that you want. You can get this in an extra fine, a medium. There isn't a huge amount of difference in the line width between, let's say, a fine and an extra fine, but there is quite a difference between the extra fine and the broad. If you want a very thin line, then you want to go with an extra fine. You're not going to get a line with the Safari, or another pen that I would recommend is the Kaweco Sport. This is a pocket pen. It's very small, but it gets to a reasonable size and does a nice extra fine line. But the extra fine of these relatively affordable pens tends not to be as fine as the finest magic marker type pen like I showed you, that Pilot makes or Zebra makes, that you can get as fine as micro point, right? To get a fountain pen with that kind of extra fine line, you really do have to pay more. Platinum makes an extra fine, the 3776, which I think is a really nice pen. I reviewed that. I talked about that in a YouTube video a while ago. And that would cost you maybe, well, it depends on if you get it from a Japanese dealer or an American dealer. It could cost as much as $200, or I think I bought one for around $100 on eBay. So you have to go more if you want something that's very fine and you're using it to, let's say, do cross hatching. So I'm recommending, I guess, for that person who wants to draw a line that is very consistent, I think I really like Lamy Safari pens. I also like Kaweco pens. The other choice that people like a lot is TWSBI, a TWSBI Echo. Now, keep in mind something else. You have to get ink into these pens. So if you're looking at the Safari, you'll notice that the Safari that I have here, the Vista Safaris are clear demonstrators, so you can see through them. I have a converter in this. The converter with Safari is extra. The Kaweco pen that I have here, I have a cartridge in. So the converter allows you to put different color inks into it. The Kaweco here, I have just a cartridge in it, but you can get a very tiny little converter that will fit into this pen, but that again is extra. So you might be able to get this for under $30, but you have to pay extra for the converter for the pen. It has to be a tiny converter to fit into a pen like this. The TWSBI Echo is a piston filler, so it actually sort of has built in the ability to use different inks. It doesn't take cartridges, however, which can be very convenient when you're traveling. So it's a little more expensive, but it has that built-in ability, so you balance that out. Now keep in mind that if you choose an extra fine nib, the experience of writing or drawing is going to be a little more scratchy. In the fountain pen world, we call that feedback. As I get more and more into fountain pens, I don't like feedback. So I'm somebody who tends to gravitate more to mediums and even broads. When you write, you are using the pen differently than when you draw, right? You have a different function, and I particularly find it more pleasurable to draw with a broad nib or medium nib. While for drawing, I have lots of pens that actually flex, and they flex from an extra fine or extra fine to abroad. So I'm much more willing to do that when I'm drawing than when I'm writing. When I write, I really don't like writing with an extra fine. And that's something to keep in mind. Is sort of there's a kind of obsession out there to try to find a pen that will do everything. And I think it makes more sense to have different pens for different functions. Now, let's say that you are somebody who uses dip pens now, and you're used to pens having about a flexibility to them, to be able to, when you press down, get a thicker line, or move the pen in different directions, that you're going to get different variations to the line. Well, is there anything for you for under $50? And yes, there are. You have sort of less of a choice in that price range, but there are some really excellent choices, I think, for you. Now, Noodler's makes a whole range of pens, their AAB line, and some of their other pens that have what are called flex nibs, steel flex nibs, or you might say semi-flex nibs. There's a whole issue about what constitutes a really flex nib. Anyway, I haven't had the greatest luck with the Noodler pens. A lot of people swear by them. They're very affordable, so that's something that's great about them. And Noodler's makes a whole range of wonderful inks and experiments with all kinds of pens. So I am all for that company, but I have not had the greatest luck using their flex nibs. When you use a flex nib, it tends to be a very wet pen, meaning it uses a lot of ink. If you imagine, the thicker the line, the more ink you're going to use. And there often with a flex nib, there is a flow problem. You don't get enough ink to the pen, and the pen starts to skip or railroad. It's one of the things that it does. And I find that the AHAB pens and the Noodler pens tend to do that unless you draw very slowly. And I don't draw slowly. I want to draw quickly. So I have gravitated to pens that are made by Fountain Pen Revolution. And I've done several reviews of their pens. This is the Himalaya version 2, I believe, and it has the number 6 Ultra Flex Nib, steel nib, which I think is just remarkable and draws really, really well. This pen lists for $49, I believe, and I think there's I think if you buy something else, it's like a line there just at the $49 mark. You get free shipping, but they often have sales at the Fountain Pen Revolution, and so you can get the pen for even less. And I think it's a great bargain. I think, first of all, it's a really beautiful looking pen. It comes in all different colors, and I think the nib performs really, really well and allows you to get a thick and thin line, as you can see. And so that's a great choice for under $50. And it's key that you get it. It comes with an ebonite feed. The ebonite feed assures that it gets enough ink to the nib. Some of their other pens, you can get the Ultra Flex nib, but it doesn't. It's not an option to use it with the ebonite feed. So make sure that whichever pen that you choose, because you can get all kinds of different pens on Fountain Pen Revolution that will work with the Ultra Flex nib, but just make sure that that you have an option for the ebonite feed, because I think that's very, very important. Now, let's say that you want to get line variation, but you're not so obsessed with the line being very extra fine per se, and we're more interested in sort of a kind of expressive effect. You might be the type of person who uses a bamboo dip pen, made out of bamboo, Chinese pen, and or Asian pen. I think they're used in Japan as well. And you want to get something like that. Well, you're in luck. There is a way to get that, a similar effect. And that's by using a pen with what's called a foodie nib that is bent, or bent nib. And there are a lot of great choices for that. I have done a very elaborate review on YouTube of the Duke 600 pen, which I love. It's only around $20, and that pen gives you this wonderful, almost like brush-like line, or a thin line, depending on how you hold the pen. And if you kind of draw with it without sort of being so self-conscious about it, you get a really wonderful kind of crazy expressive line that can give a drawing a line of the figure or of a landscape a lot of feeling to it, a lot of sort of a wonderful kind of accidental expressiveness, I think. I also love using a pen like that to use it to fill in areas of black or whatever color the pen is you're using, right? Again, for me, it works a little bit like something I can use to draw with, but also to fill in areas as if it were a brush. So that's really terrific. I want to thank Mark Compagnetz. I never actually have to make sure. One of these days I have to ask him exactly how he pronounces his name. Anyway, Mark, who has a wonderful YouTube channel and has given me so much advice, he suggested and talks about this pen, which looks so bizarre. This is the Maijun Q1, and it's in this format. Supposedly is supposed to be really good for people who have arthritis. It looks really crazy, like it's uncomfortable, but actually it's incredibly comfortable. Maybe because I'm old and my hands are going, but it's really comfortable, and it holds a tremendous amount of ink. It's an eyedropper, so you fill the barrel here with ink, and it has this Fude nib. And I just enjoy this pen so much for doodling while watching television at night. I just think it's terrific, and it's an incredible bark, and it's around, you can get it for around $20. So this is a great choice. And this is an example of having not just one pen, maybe having two pens, having a Safari and having this pen, and then you have a sort of arsenal ready to go to do a drawing. You don't have to have just one pen do everything. Okay, so where are we? Now, here's the question. What if you spent more money and you decided that you wanted to, really splurge and pay? Now, I think the next great stage up in pens is to get a flex pen and one of the pilot, I think particularly one of the pilot pens, Falcon, with a Falcon nib. It's called a Falcon nib because the nib looks a bit like a bird, has a kind of bird-like shape. And they have a line of pens, the actual Falcon pens, and they make one that is a soft, extra fine. And I think it's very good, particularly if you on the extra fine a spectrum of flexibility. If you're doing a lot of cross hatching, it's a bit scratchy. In other words, it has quite a lot of feedback. And it's the first pen that I bought, really, that was an expensive pen. The reason it's so expensive is that it has a 14 karat nib, so it's gold. And actually, considering that in comparison to a lot of expensive American pens and Italian pens and German pens, it's very reasonably priced. It's even more reasonable if you buy it from an international dealer, a Japanese dealer right now. So there's the Falcon SEF, if you want something that is very fine to maybe, broad or Western medium. And then there's one of my favorite pens that is more expensive. We'll run more like $200 to $250, which is the 743 with a Falcon nib. So you can get the 743 in all kinds of nibs, but you want to make sure that you get the Falcon nib, and that nib has the flexibility. And I find that is really the best of all worlds, because although it has the line variation, it also is very smooth. It isn't as scratchy. It doesn't have as much feedback. Now, some people have had problems with flow with the 743. I personally have not experienced that problem. But if you do, you may want to purchase a special ebonite feed for it that you can get for around $30 with shipping. It's probably $40 extra, which may seem ridiculous since you've paid so much for the pen to begin with, but I think is okay, given the fact that once you have paid this money, and if you take care of that pen will last you a lifetime. And that's one of the things about really nice fountain pens, is that if you take care of them, if you clean them, if you don't just let them lie around and let the ink dry in them, which you must not do, then they will last a very long time, and even you can even sell them to someone else if you find that you don't use them. So that's one of the terrific things which you can't really do with a magic marker. They become almost heirlooms, and that's a marvelous thing about them. They also a really good fountain pen, as I've said before, that kind of floats over the paper and has a kind of personality that I find really marvelous and inspiring. So that's something that happens to you as you go through this whole process. Now, there's one last thing, which is the issue of ink, right? So one thing you must not do with any of the pens that I have mentioned here is put traditional India ink into them, the kind of Indian ink that you would use with a dip pen. The reason you can't do that is I believe India ink has a little bit of shellac in it. If it dries, it will ruin the pen. So you don't want to put Indian ink in it. They make a kind of India ink that is specially formulated for fountain pens, and there are inks that are waterproof that work with fountain pens. Most inks that go into fountain pens, including the inks that you get in the disposable pen and in most of the cartridges, are not waterproof. So if you're going to watercolor over the pen line, it's going to run a bit. And I actually like that effect and often use that in an expressive way in the drawings that I do in my book or my sketchbooks or some of the drawings that you've seen me do on this channel. But if you don't like that effect, then you need to use one of the inks that is waterproof. And I've actually done a YouTube video comparing different blacks, but I think the best value in black ink that is waterproof is the platinum carbon ink. And that even comes in cartridges. Unfortunately, those cartridges only work in platinum pens, but let's say you did purchase the Platinum 3776, you could use that in that pen. Or if you wanted a very inexpensive pen to start out with in the fountain pen world, which is the Platinum Preppy pen, which is the same price as a disposable, but will use cartridges, and even I think you can even get a converter for the Preppy that will use these platinum carbon cartridges. So that's an alternative, an inexpensive alternative. Keep in mind that the waterproof inks and the platinum inks are more likely to stain your pen. They have tiny, tiny little bits of carbon material in the ink. So let's say you left that ink in your pen for months and months and months and you didn't use it and you let it dry out in the pen, you're going to have a harder time cleaning it out. So if you favor that type of ink, I would wash your pens, much more frequently than if you used, for example, Waterman Black pen, Intense Black, which is a very safe ink, very affordable ink, and I think a perfectly wonderful black choice if you're using black ink. Perhaps not as dark a color as platinum, carbon platinum, and some other blacks, but I think it works in general. In general, I'm a huge fan of the Waterman inks. They're very just straightforward. They're decent colors. They're very safe in all kinds of vintage pens. People who are vintage fountain pen lovers use the Waterman pen ink So that's always a good choice if you're thinking about just safety and also affordability. So I hope that this is useful. Please put your thoughts about this or comments. I'm sure other people would disagree about what is their favorite pen. It's sort of like just take the plunge. But I think the key thing is when you're trying to think of, well, what fountain pen to get, you shouldn't be starting out with the idea, well, which brand is the best, right? Or which pen is the best. Rather, you should start out with the question, what kind of a drawing are you going to do? Do you need the line to have variation, or do you want a consistent line? A lot of artists are doing things, diagrams, or they're doing certain kinds of line art where they want a very, very consistent line. Well, then you want a certain kind of pen. Or if you want flex, then you're going to want another kind of pen. You can get carried away with all these reviews of people like me who just are sort of love all fountain pens and are always looking for variety and different kinds of fountain pens, different kinds of filling mechanisms, when what you want is just probably just a reliable pen that is going to get that line down, and what's most important is the drawing itself. So I hope this is helpful. If it is helpful, please, please subscribe. That's the way to support this kind of channel and makes me feel good. And I'll see you next time.